At Cambridge University, Professor Harry Whittington walks slowly through the halls of the Department of Earth Sciences. The late afternoon sun shines slanted beams through the Victorian building's high windows, making the dust motes dance through the air as the scholar unconsciously steps from one illuminated rectangle to another. Students rush past him the other way, late as usual for some lecture or seminar. They mutter good day to the professor or cast a furtive glance in his direction. But Harry Whittington does not acknowledge them, nor does he even really see them, because his mind is somewhere else. Back in his office, thinking for the 1000th time about the skeleton in his closet. Of course, it isn't a real skeleton. The fossils that Harry Whittington studies long predate anything so advanced. Rather, he has spent the bulk of his career studying the primitive creatures of the early Paleozoic, most especially trilobites, but also the then famed flattened fossils of the Burgess Shale. After almost 50 years of concerted academic work at some of the most esteemed institutions including Harvard, Yale, Birmingham and Cambridge, he is undoubtedly one of the world's foremost experts on Cambrian life. And yet, one fossil in his possession threatens all of that. However long he stares at it, however many times he turns it over in his hands, and whichever angle he looks at it, Whittington simply can't figure it out. This specimen had been originally delivered to the professor from the Geological Survey of Canada, from strata very close to the iconic Burgess Shale location, and it was remarkable in being much, much bigger than anything else yet found from that time. It was undoubtedly a fossil of some kind, but no one, not even the great Harry Whittington, had been able to quite literally make head nor tail of it. So the professor did what most of us do when faced with a vexing problem. Subscribing to the maxim of out of sight, out of mind, he hid it in a drawer. Ever since Charles Doolittle Walcott had stumbled across the Burgess Shale in 1911, the exceptionally preserved fossils this rock formation contained had given unprecedented insight into the Cambrian explosion. Arguably the most remarkable leap in evolution in the entire history of life. But interpreting these fossils was not straightforward. Not only were they partly degraded, squashed and flattened between layers of mudstone, but the organisms themselves were extremely primitive, representing the very first experiments into animal body plans and lifestyles. When faced with a blackened shadow on a rock surface, a paleontologist like Whittington needed a sharp eye and an even sharper mind in order to puzzle out its affinity. Often coming down to a best guess, based on the most tenuous of evidence. In 1886, for example, Victorian paleontologists described a curved, rigid fossil with what appeared to be legs on its underside as Anomalocaris, meaning strange shrimp. Because that's exactly what it looked like, the headless rear end of an odd-looking shrimp. Later, Walcott himself flexed his comparative anatomy muscles when he described Peitoia, a ring-shaped fossil with radial grooves and a central hole, looking more like a pineapple slice than anything else. He supposed that Peitoia was in fact an ancient jellyfish, despite the fact that it showed none of the features shared by living jellyfish, like gonads or tentacles, and that no jellyfish alive or dead was known to have a hole through its centre. Indeed, another of Walcott's fossils, Lagonia, had even less anatomical detail to recommend it to a particular animal phylum. Walcott originally supposed it to be a badly preserved sea cucumber, a member of the echinoderms, but it was later demoted to a mere sponge. and a squashed one at that. And so in truth, nobody really knew what these fossils were. And over the next 100 years, they were revisited time and time again by paleontologists keen to find an elusive clue that would reveal their true identity. New, bizarre organisms were discovered among living animals and compared to their fossil counterparts. But nothing seemed to fit. In the end, it would take an outrageous act of destruction to solve the mysteries of Anomalocaris, Peitoia, and Ligonia. The truth, it turned out, was stranger than anyone could have imagined. Finally, Harry Whittington decided that he had been tortured long enough by his giant paleontological enigma. Too many times had he opened the drawer, stared in at the offending fossil waiting for inspiration to strike, and closed it again in dismay. But this afternoon was different. This time, the scholar took out the fossil, laid it carefully under the light, and then did the unthinkable. With a rotary engraving pen, he dug down into the fossil, grinding away at its surface details, lifting thin layers of shale and carbon impression to see what lay underneath. He was hoping to find something new, perhaps a leg or an eye or some kind of a gut that could point him in the right direction. But to his surprise, he found Anomalocaris, that strange shrimp first discovered 100 years earlier, seemingly attached to the giant's underside. Inspired by this discovery, the professor and his graduate student Derek Briggs took a similarly destructive approach to a slew of underwhelming enigmatic fossils from the university's collection, beginning to notice an intriguing pattern. Time and time again, they found the shrimp-like Anomalocaris closely associated with the pineapple slice Peitoia and the suspected sponge Ligonia. Once or twice, and the arrangement could be chalked up to chance, but in almost every specimen they examined, the three fossils clustered together. And so what if, Whittington supposed, they were not distinct fossils of distinct organisms at all, but component parts of a single, massive organism? If so, that organism would be far larger than anything else that existed at the time, perhaps had ever existed up until that point. A leviathan whose mouth alone dwarfed most of the denizens of the Cambrian seas. Following the convention to retain the oldest of the fossil designations, this new gigantic fossil inherited the name Anomalocaris. And as researchers studied and reinterpreted its anatomy, this strangest of shrimps' true nature was revealed. With its great size, fearsome grasping appendages attached to its head, and a circular mouth rimmed with hardened plates, Anomalocaris was nothing less than an apex predator of the Cambrian Ocean. And in fact, the first predator on Earth. But life had managed for several billion years without any predators, so what had changed? How did evolution conspire to create an animal that wreaks only destruction on its fellows? And what impact did this new entrant have on the ever-changing game of life? This episode of History of the Earth is brought to you by Raycon, a great choice for your everyday earbuds. Not only are Raycon's everyday earbuds reliable with an impressive 32-hour battery life, they offer premium, professional sound quality to rival the big names in the field. With new multi-point connectivity, you can pair with two devices at once. And now, with active noise cancellation, you can comfortably enjoy History of the Earth on long flights and trains, at the gym, and other noisy environments. And when you're done, you can put them back in their stylish protective case to recharge them wirelessly. And Raycons don't just sound amazing, they're comfortable, suited for long sessions of writing, video editing, and other creative and work tasks. Raycons are affordable too, starting at half the price of other premium brands. And even better, for a limited time they're up to 30% off for Black Friday. So head over to buyraycon.com/earth and input the offer code to get your earbuds. Thanks to Raycon for supporting educational content on YouTube. Now back to the epic story of life on Earth. On the 12th of January 1995, while bystanders watched from the roadside, a long white truck drove slowly through the northern entrance to Yellowstone National Park. It was a momentous but controversial occasion, as this modern-day Trojan horse carried 8 live and hungry grey wolves, due to be released into one of America's most popular holiday destinations. Beginning their journey over 1,000 kilometers away in Alberta, it was the first time wolves had been seen in the area for 70 years. Their arrival was met with hope and trepidation. For some 750,000 years, packs of grey wolves had roamed freely across North America, and for the last 15,000 years or so had lived in an uneasy peace and mutual respect with Native American tribes. But that all changed with the arrival of the Europeans and the spread of agriculture and pastoral farming they brought with them. The wolves became a threat and a nuisance, and a target for impressive hunting bounties. By 1920, they'd been largely hunted to extinction. For the ranchers around Yellowstone, this was only a good thing. But inside the national park, the ecology soon began to unravel. Without wolves to hunt them, the elk population exploded, their relentless grazing clearing the wilderness of much of its vegetation. As early as 1930, conservationists noted the degradation of the landscape. And so it was hoped that the reintroduction of apex predators to Yellowstone would work to redress the ecological balance. But almost a century had passed, and in truth there was no knowing what the effects would be. The wolves, of course, could simply leave, making their way back to northern Canada. They could fail to thrive in the new and unfamiliar environment. Or they could succeed too well, completely wiping out the park's elk and many other species besides, even possibly becoming a threat to tourists in nearby towns. So, as the cages were opened, it's little wonder that everyone watching held their breath. Fortunately, after a couple of initial escapes, the predators did settle into their new home. The hunting of the ever-growing pack successfully brought down the population of elk, while also preying on deer, foxes, and badgers. Rather than decimating Yellowstone's biodiversity, these new apex predators triggered a trophic cascade of positive impacts. Fewer elk and deer meant fewer mouths to feed from the park's undergrowth. Not only that, but the wolves' presence changed the behavior of the herds, keeping them alert and on the move, and preventing them from overgrazing any particular part of the park. With the return of the vegetation came cover and food for small mammals, and their numbers soared, providing food for other predators in the area, including birds of prey. The return of the plants revitalized the soils, stabilizing the landscape and providing positive feedback for the growth of more varied and healthy vegetation. And this in turn supported a boost in beavers, bison, birds, and bears, all within less than a decade after the wolves' arrival. In the end, the restoration of these crucial members of the Yellowstone ecology helped to balance populations and communities in ways that even the most hopeful conservationists couldn't have predicted. Visitors today may be warned to keep an eye out for any of the 100 or so grey wolves that call the park their home, but at the same time they can enjoy a rich and balanced natural ecosystem, thriving as it had for hundreds of thousands of years. Though the late Precambrian and early Cambrian oceans of 500 million years ago were much simpler ecosystems than modern Yellowstone, they were nevertheless subject to many of the same pressures and feedbacks. There were the producers, bacteria and photosynthetic algae, precursors to plants that would take in inorganic compounds from the air, water, and earth, and transform them into organic molecules within their own cells. And there were the consumers, simple animals or their precursors who took advantage of those handily packaged organic molecules for their own nutrition. These herbivores found ways to filter out the living bacteria and algae that floated in the water column, or munched through the cellular vegetation that stretched web-like over the seafloor surface. And in these ancient seas, there were decomposers as well. In the oft-overlooked bacteria, protists, and fungi that break down dead organisms, recycling their components and returning them to the water and sediment, in return for just a little for themselves. These decomposers kept the nutrient cycle cycling, ensuring vital elements were available for the growth of more photosynthesizing algae and the rest of the food chain it supports. Such an ecology, simple though it was self-sufficient and self-sustaining, with nothing more complicated needed to ensure its health or longevity. And yet, following the genetic and evolutionary leaps of the Cambrian explosion, the development of increasingly advanced animal bodies opened up new ecological possibilities for pioneering organisms to explore. For some, this meant tapping into more of the vegetative bounty of the shallow seas, learning how to climb higher or dig deeper to access previously unreachable algal growth. But for others, it meant blazing an entirely new trail through the food chain. Because while plant matter is plentiful and easy to eat, it isn't always the easiest to digest. Cellulose cell walls are hard to break down, and the nutritional content of the stuff inside is often scant. Modern-day cows, which have evolved over millions of years to exist on a diet of grass alone, have had to innovate with a complex, multi-stage digestive system including 4 separate stomachs, simply to extract the nutrients they need from their meals, and still spending much of their waking hours in a state of consumption. Not only that, but primary producers are often not the passive food sources we imagine them to be. In order to hang on to the organic molecules they've worked so hard to fabricate from thin air and water, plants and algae equip themselves with myriad chemical and physical defenses, in the shape of toxins, mucus like slime, and thorns. Even the earliest producers in the Proterozoic oceans may have girded themselves against consumption by floating freely, thickening their cellulose armor, and colonizing places that grazers could not follow. But in contrast to the producers, the earliest animals themselves offered a much more tantalizing digestive prospect. Thanks to the innovations of more complex tissue and varied cell types, every gram of animal flesh contains far more energy than an equivalent gram of photosynthesizing bacteria or algae. Not only that, but the organic molecules have already been pre-packaged into compounds that an animal needs, like proteins and fats. And without cell walls to protect their nutritious innards, the bounty of animal flesh is simpler and less energetically taxing to digest. Looking at it this way, when such a feast lay ripe for the taking, the evolution of secondary consumers in the form of predators was inevitable. And so some 500 million years ago, when the first predators began consuming the flesh of their neighbors, they changed the rules of the game. A brand new player was introduced, disrupting forevermore the previously simple and stable cycle of life and death. The endless power of the sun ensures that photosynthesizers can thrive and continue to thrive despite being almost continuously consumed. The success of the grazers therefore depends only on the supply of food, meaning their populations reach an equilibrium relative to that supply. The grazing herd, whether it be gazelles, snails, or prehistoric Cambrian crawlers, will only grow so large as the population of primary producers can support. But, with predators in the mix, at least one more layer of complexity, known as a trophic level, is added to the food chain. Each kept in balance by the other. Today, from foxes and hares to sharks and seals, the cyclic ebb and flow of predator and prey that began in the Cambrian is seen in ecosystems all over the planet. And when one grows too large, the balance is ultimately redressed naturally. But thanks to the inefficiency of energy transfer from one level of the food chain to the next, predators can only tap into roughly about 10% of their prey's potential. The ultimate size, known as the carrying capacity of an entire ecosystem, is therefore controlled by the total amount of solar energy that photosynthesizers, at the bottom of the food chain, convert into organic molecules. As a result, in Yellowstone, where the populations of elk can reach over 10,000 in the summer, there are never more than around 150 wolves in the park. There simply isn't enough energy to support more. But of course, in natural ecosystems, the situation is rarely so simplistic. Most organisms typically enjoy more than one food source, leading to a complex food web of tangled and overlapping trophic levels and interdependencies. But as the rewilding of Yellowstone showed, in just a few short years, the presence of predators at one or more of those trophic levels can have wide-ranging and ultimately positive effects on the rest of the ecology. Most predators will target the easiest prey, picking off lame and sick individuals who can't otherwise keep up with their kin. And in doing so, the predators are doing the rest of that group a favor, removing those that could slow them all down or spread sickness throughout the herd. And this means that counterintuitively, as the wolves of Yellowstone show, far from decimating plant eaters' numbers, predation helps to keep prey animals alive. And this is as true now as it was in the early Cambrian oceans. Rather than hampering the success of the early seafloor grazers, the arrival of predators supercharged their own evolution, elevating life to a level and complexity never before seen on Earth. As soon as Orville and Wilbur Wright took to the skies in the first aeroplane in 1902, their invention, one of the great leaps forward for humanity, was greedily eyed by the world's warmongers. The best tacticians and strategists of all Earth's nations knew that war had never really been about brute strength, but the advantages each side could gain over the other. And so, regardless of the intention of its invention, the advent of flight at the beginning of the 20th century was too tempting a tactical edge to ignore. It was less than a decade later, in 1911, that planes were first used in war. In the form of unarmed reconnaissance aircraft deployed by Italians against the Ottoman Empire in Libya, purely to survey the layout of the enemy in Tripoli. But from that moment on, the concept of defensible airspace was born. The next generation of aircraft were launched with guns to try and shoot down those survey craft. The concept of aerial warfare developed further throughout the years of the First World War, with both sides scrambling to build and arm battle-capable aircraft, as well as train pilots to fly them for the very first time. But when both sides had pilots and weaponized aircraft, simply flying, pointing and shooting was no longer enough. And the newly formed air forces needed to develop innovative aerial tactics in order to gain an upper hand. Pilots would seek the element of surprise by flying out of the sun and other highly skillful maneuvers, showcasing their sheer gall by flying and shooting straight at the enemy before rolling away at the last possible moment. Dogfighting was as much an art as a science, and all combat pilots trained in the techniques needed to survive such an encounter. Before long, air forces set their sights on ground targets too, with planes adapted to carry and drop rudimentary bombs. While fighter planes were still the main defense against such an attack, advance warning of their arrival could make the difference between their success or failure. Britain tackled this problem by building a series of immense sound mirrors along the south coast. These concave concrete constructions were designed to focus the sound waves from prop-powered aircraft approaching over the English Channel, allowing them to be heard long before they came into view and giving defensive forces time to scramble. But as the speed of planes increased, the success of these mirrors was short-lived. In response, during the Second World War, the UK in particular secretly developed a new electronic technology for estimating the distance and direction of objects at range. Technology we still use today. This was the age of radar. Ranging stations on the ground could do the job of sound mirrors, but were far superior, precisely locating enemy craft at a distance of some 160 kilometers. Attempts to fool radar systems were met with countermeasures, with each side in the war striving to stay one step ahead. Indeed, one decisive moment came in 1940, when Allied engineers developed a powerful, small-scale radar device that could be installed in the planes themselves. contributing to turning the tide of the war and ushering in the age of electronic warfare. And so, over the last half-century, ongoing conflict all over the world has seen the arms race of aerial warfare advance so far beyond the Wright brothers' first flight as to be all but unrecognizable. Aircraft become faster, more aerodynamic, quieter, and less visible. Fighter pilots are trained and tested to the very limits of human endurance. And flight technologies are now instantaneous, predictive and intelligent, to the point where human pilots only slow them down. All of this has been necessary because the field of warfare never sits still. Necessity is the mother of invention, and there is no greater need than survival in the face of a deadly enemy. For every step that one side makes, the opposing side must counter or face total destruction. This dance has shaped the technological leaps of the 20th century, just as it shaped the evolutionary leaps of the last 500 million years. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is framed around 4 central tenets. That there is variation among populations, that there is competition for resources, that only the fittest will survive, and that the survivors reproduce and pass on their successful traits. Survival of the fittest is the mechanism by which many living organisms acquire their most characteristic features. If there's something that needs to be done, there's probably an optimal way to do it, and the individual that most closely approaches that optimal is the most likely to survive and reproduce. In ecosystems where there are predators and prey, this leads to common characteristics shared by those doing the hunting and those being hunted. Predators are typically equipped with ferocious tools for rending flesh, including sharp teeth in the front of the mouth and sharp, curved claws on the forelimbs. They have front-facing eyes whose visual fields overlap, allowing them precise depth perception. It may come at the expense of peripheral vision, but when an animal is at the top of the food chain, there's really nothing that can approach that presents a threat. And they often have larger, more developed brains, with an emphasis on problem-solving and cooperation, since greater hunting success often comes from planning, predicting, and working together. Conversely, prey animals often defend themselves with mineralized or hardened outer shells and skeletons, intended to repel the teeth and claws of their hunters and protect their most vital organs. They may go so far as to sacrifice entire limbs in order to escape a predator's clutches. They have eyes situated on the sides of their heads, with non-overlapping fields of vision, giving them a wide-angle view of their surroundings and minimizing blind spots from which a hunter can approach. And they typically evolve to have heightened senses, whether through vision, sound, or scent, with large portions of their brains dedicated to processing and acting on these stimuli quickly enough to allow an escape. There are, however, many characteristics that both predators and prey share, which can also give them the edge for survival. Both have speed on their side. Whether chasing or being chased, neither group can afford to be sluggish. Both exploit camouflage to blend into their surroundings, whether to avoid becoming a target or to gain the element of surprise. Both can deploy chemicals as part of their offensive or defensive arsenal. Venoms and toxins can paralyze or kill prey or attackers alike. Both populations have the capacity to cooperate in groups, whether finding safety in the herd or hunting as a pack. And both are capable of deception and subterfuge, looking or acting differently to how their adversary might expect. But while we may observe these common traits in animals alive today, and note how Darwin's natural selection and survival of the fittest colluded to produce them, this is only part of the story. Indeed, the assumption that there is an optimal anatomy or behavior for a predator in a given environment is fundamentally flawed, because the very existence of that predator changes the environment, along with all the living components within it. Prey will also adapt to survive, striving towards an optimal form or function. That in turn changes the pressures and requirements placed on the predator to succeed, effectively shifting the goalposts for success forever out of reach. And so ultimately, there is no static, optimal blueprint for the greatest predator, because nothing in nature exists in isolation. This was a concept first noted in 1973 by the American evolutionary biologist Lee Van Valen, providing a much-needed update to the accepted but incomplete evolutionary dynamics outlined by Darwin and his successors. Acknowledging that any good theory needs an even more powerful analogy, Van Valen likened his concept to a quote by the fictional Red Queen in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. In describing the strange physics of a race in Wonderland, the Queen explains, "Now, here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place." In his Red Queen hypothesis, what Van Valen sought to demonstrate is that in a dynamic ecosystem, an organism cannot evolve to an optimal form for their environment and just stay there. Nor can they afford to evolve at the same steady pace that Darwin's incremental evolution suggests. Instead, in the face of competition and predation, they must keep changing and keep innovating at an accelerated pace, just to be able to keep up with the innovations of each other. An arms race of evolution only leaves room for further escalation. And like the military technology of the early 20th century, if any one side of that race falls behind, it faces complete destruction. And Van Valen went further, suggesting a biological mechanism for this evolutionary arms race. Sexual reproduction is an energetically costly endeavour, requiring two parents to cloning's one, as well as the complex dance of sex cell production, fertilization, and growth. So in order for sex to be widespread among multicellular organisms, it must confer an advantage that outweighs its cost. And that advantage, Van Valen asserted, was to not be left behind in the Red Queen's race. For billions of years, asexually reproducing organisms evolved slowly, acquiring new traits thanks to random and incremental genetic mutations, like swapping out a single card in a deck each time you deal. But sexual reproduction produces far greater genetic variety every time sex cells are formed and recombined, equivalent to shuffling the entire pack of cards before the deal. Ultimately, it enables much faster changes in appearance and behavior, and greater opportunity to respond to changes in the environment. And naturally, once one organism was striding ahead with sexual reproduction, the others couldn't afford to evolve any slower. In this new, sexual world, it takes all the evolving you can do just to stay alive. and sexual reproduction in animals who were also locked in the dance of predator and prey led to the rapid acquisition of sharpened teeth, of defensive shells, of baffling camouflage, and of super senses. For example, bats hunt their insect prey at night when there is less competition from other predators. But in order to detect that prey in darkness, they've turned away from traditional visual detection, relying instead on sound through echolocation. Letting out an ultrasonic click not too dissimilar to radar, they listen for the echoes from the surrounding landscape and potential prey, to build a picture in their minds with no light necessary. When tracking down their favorite prey, moths, they squeak in rapid succession for a higher definition image, before honing straight in on the target and snatching it out of the air. In response to this, the moths evolved ears, despite making no sound themselves, purely to listen out for those echolocating clicks. With the sound of doom approaching, they would be able to initiate evasive maneuvers, altering their flight and dropping out of the sky at the last moment to avoid certain death. But in turn, the bats soon became wise to the moths' dogfighting tactics, and made the sharp twists and turns themselves to counter the feints. So some moths responded with yet another new approach. Instead of trying to outrun their hunters, they would instead render them blind with a rudimentary form of sonar jamming. When they hear the quickening clicks of an approaching predator, the moth lets out its own ultrasonic clicks at a high enough frequency to muddy the echo image that's returned to the bat's ears. Without the image, the bat is no better than any daytime hunter, and the moth is safe. In the deep geological past, it is also possible to see the escalation of arms and armor among mollusks and their hunters too. In the early Cambrian, the first mollusks may have resembled the garden slugs of today, all juicy flesh and no defense. The first animals who were inclined to devour that flesh would have found nothing standing in their way. And so, when chance recombination first produced hardened body parts, those individuals became the least palatable of the Cambrian smorgasbord, and therefore had an immediate survival advantage. Natural selection favored thicker, sturdier, and more consolidated armor, until many mollusks grew inside a hardened shell that made them infinitely less appealing. If predators wanted to eat, they would need to find a way inside those shells. And so they evolved hardened mouthparts of their own that could crush, rend, and bore through the protective armor. Both sides now having entered the mineralized age, they faced off with ever-increasing thickness and strength until entirely new strategies were needed. Swimming predators eventually developed jaws that used the physics of levers to crush even the hardiest of mollusk shells. And mollusks developed other defensive weapons and tactics, using camouflage to avoid notice altogether, or fluids to distract and dazzle their hunters while they made good their escape. And so the pressures of predation and the Red Queen's race have shaped the evolution of many, if not all, of the animals through the Phanerozoic. They have produced the characteristic features of both predators and prey that we see today, and they will continue to transform organisms at an accelerated rate into the future. The link between predation and evolution is clear. Whenever there are accelerated rates of biological innovation producing high biodiversity, there is also evidence of more intense predation. And yet, the driving factor is not so obvious. Does an increase in diversity open the door to an ecology that supports more predators? Or does a surge in predator numbers drive diversification of defensive forms and behaviors? Most likely, it is a combination of both, in a constantly changing and evolving dynamic system. But if we hope to fully understand these 500 million years of conflict escalation, we need to go back to the beginning to find the very first predator of all, and understand that fateful moment that animal turned on its kin for the very first time. Climbing the steps towards the grand porticoed entrance of the Field Museum in Chicago, a vast classical hall opens up, bathed in sunlight and filled with the ancient and modern delights of the natural world. Climbing the stairs to the upper level, passing through the griffin halls of ancient life, you will find Sue. The largest and most complete Tyrannosaurus rex ever discovered. With similar dimensions to a school bus, Sue stretches 12 meters from nose to tail, standing 4 meters tall at the hip. Named for her discoverer, Susan Hendrickson, we don't know whether the T-Rex was male or female. They are barrel-chested, with a pelvis almost as long as a person. Their skull alone, bristling with dozens of razor-sharp teeth, weighs 270 kilos. They have huge, clawed, three-toed feet, but bafflingly tiny arms. 7 years after its discovery in 1990, the specimen was auctioned to the Field Museum for the staggering sum of $8.3 million. The most ever paid for a fossil at the time. And at the museum, Sue has been granted a new life. They have their own social media account, as well as a brand new exhibit that showcases them hunting, fighting, and scavenging in a prehistoric landscape. Tyrannosaurus rex is the most famous of all the dinosaur predators, and Sue was undoubtedly the master, or mistress, of all they surveyed. But while the public rushed to admire this king or queen of the Cretaceous jungle, scientists also clamour to understand more about how Sue lived. Their skeleton has revealed that Sue was 28 years old when they died, and weighed up to 14 tons. They bear an injury to their right shoulder, and evidence of 3 broken but subsequently healed ribs. Holes in Sue's jaw and skull could have been from the teeth of other dinosaurs, painting a picture of a gigantic, ferocious, and brutally physical predator that would stop at nothing to pursue its prey or defend its kill. And yet, closer examination of T-Rex skeletons, including Sue's, have revealed some surprising truths about this apex predator's capabilities. For one, its famously short arms, often the subject of ridicule, may have been more flexible than we first thought. When manipulating the limbs of the predator's closest relatives, turkeys and crocodiles, To understand how cartilage, muscles, and tendons worked within the T-Rex's arms, scientists have found that they would have been able to easily turn their wrists inwards to clutch a small item of prey close to its chest. Not only that, but biomechanical studies of the stresses applied to the predator's legs when bearing that immense 14-ton weight reveal that T-Rex probably wouldn't have been able to run at all. Instead, being limited to a walking gait and a maximum speed of 30 kilometers per hour. So an Olympic sprinter would easily outrun this ferocious beast, as would many smaller and more nimble dinosaurs. These two facts tell us an unsettling truth about the most feared predator of the ancient Earth. Sioux and its kin weren't perhaps so terrible after all. They were certainly predators, the sharpened teeth and claws a testament to that. And with such great size, there were few others that would have threatened them. But their own sights were probably set much lower than we imagine. On the small, slow-moving creatures that they could catch, or the even slower carcasses of already deceased dinosaurs. As much as we may hate to admit it, Sioux seems to have been as much a scavenger as a deadly hunter. Identifying predators in the fossil record, from their basic anatomy and the co-evolution of their prey, may seem straightforward, but truly understanding their role in an ancient ecology is often far more complex. Scientific consensus ever-changing down the generations. This means that when we return to the Cambrian Ocean, we must look carefully at all of the fossil evidence to truly comprehend the rise and role of the first ever predator. The first prey are not hard to spot in Cambrian strata. Indeed, at one time, their presence was enough to define the Cambrian period itself, when paleontologists considered it the earliest time from which mineralized fossils were known. Beginning from the Tomotian period, around 530 million years ago, the first shells made of calcium carbonate and other insoluble minerals began to appear. They are small and strangely shaped, a testament to their biological origin. But it's still unclear as to what kind of organism they actually belong. Some are like tiny pointed pixie hats, while others are spines, stars, or flattened plates. With little other information to go on, these fossils are known, unoriginally, as the small, shelly fauna. But despite their mystery, scientists agree that they belong to organisms trying to protect themselves. But from what? Shells give defense against rough sea conditions, but their abundance in varied sediments worldwide makes this a difficult theory to uphold. Not only that, but once the small shelly fauna had set the trend for mineralized armor, a large proportion of the Cambrian biota followed suit. Including, notably, the most famous Cambrian animal of all, the trilobite. So there must have been some widespread and persistent pressure driving Cambrian animals to mineralize. And that pressure was most likely from predators. Predators, like Anomalocaris. And so thanks to Professor Harry Whittington and Derek Briggs, the strange shrimp that had so baffled paleontologists for 100 years has now stepped out of the shadows, along with pineapple sliced peytoia and squashed sponge lagonia, as the clawed, toothed predator of the Cambrian seas. And now, more than 40 years since its revelation, we have a better picture of this predator, or rather, family of predators, than ever before. There are now 13 distinct species of Anomalocarid described from Cambrian strata all around the world, including Canada, China, Australia, the USA, Greenland, and Morocco. Like big cats today, the species vary slightly in the shape and function of their features, in this case primarily in their eyes and frontal appendages, but all are quite clearly members of the same clan. And when compared with the majority of Cambrian animals, they are all gigantic. Typically ranging between 30 and 60 centimeters long, though some specimens are over a meter in size. But crucially, in life their bodies were soft and unmineralized. Indeed, it is this fact that made them so difficult to identify in the first place, since under normal circumstances the organic molecules of their bodily tissues would degrade away before any hope of fossilization. Only with exceptional biological preservation, like the squashed carbon films of the Burgess Shale, can we hope to see the traces of the entire animal. Their bodies are segmented, top to bottom, like a trilobite or an earthworm, and at their edges the trunk is extended into articulated swimming flaps. Paleontologists believe that the Anomalocarids undulated these flaps in a wave-like pattern, similar to a modern-day manta ray, to swim gracefully at speed through the open water. Some parts of their body were hardened, however, with a thick organic tissue, similar to the chitin of lobster shells or the keratin of fingernails. These included the paired frontal appendages and their radial mouths, which explains why it was these that lingered in Cambrian fossil strata to confuse 20th century scientists. The frontal appendages were segmented too, and often spiny on their inner edge, most likely to help with grabbing, holding, and crushing prey, before clutching it into their radially toothed maw. They also had multifaceted eyes, raised on stalks that were up to 10 times larger than a dragonfly's. Each of these compound eyes was composed of at least 16,000 individual hexagonal lenses, similar to a modern insect or a trilobite. But Anomalocaris' gigantic eyes afforded them wide-angle vision, some 30 times more powerful than a trilobite, particularly when it came to detecting movement. And yet, interestingly, despite all of this, for such a large organism, Anomalocaris had a surprisingly simple brain. Studying a particularly finely preserved specimen from China, scientists have mapped the organic remnants associated with the animal's nervous system, and have concluded that their brains are most closely related to those of modern-day velvet worms. These bizarre-looking creatures are not quite worms, not quite arthropods, but something in between. They lurk in the undergrowth of forests in the southern hemisphere, hunting small insects foolish enough to cross their path. And so in the case of Anomalocaris, it's likely that the animals they preyed on, belonging as they did to the true arthropods, had more complex brains than this hulking predator. In describing Anomalocaris, we've assumed its predatory nature from the features of its body. Large size, fast movement, sharp claws and teeth, and a piercing gaze are all characteristics shared by modern predators. But a predator is nothing without its prey. So to understand its place in the ancient ecosystem, we must look beyond Anomalocaris itself. The Cambrian was the undisputed age of the trilobite. Throughout that period of some 53 million years, these armored arthropods diversified to occupy almost every niche and habitat that the oceans offered. In certain rocks from the period, like those in the House Range and the Wellsville Mountains of Utah, collectors can find an almost limitless supply of their fossils, belonging to some 500 different species. But these fossils are commonly found with damage to their shells, often interpreted as potentially fatal injuries sustained during life, taking the form of curved or W-shaped chunks missing from the sides of the thorax. This is a pattern of breakage that is difficult to explain as natural. If they look like bite marks, paleontologists reason, then that's most likely what they are. And their shape gives a clue to the shape of the mouth that is doing the biting. And as you might have guessed, the mouth that best fits the mark is the circular toothed feeding organ of Anomalocaris. And there's yet more evidence for the predator's activity. Amazingly, the fossiliferous beds of Utah and elsewhere do not only yield trilobites, but fossilized dung as well. These pellets, preserved in calcium phosphate, are identifiable as a jumbled assemblage of organic residues and skeletal fragments. And some of the coprolites, as they are formally known, are far too large to have been produced by any trilobite. Instead, pointing to an animal the size of Anomalocaris as their creator. We know of only one Cambrian animal of such size. And indeed, inside Anomalocaris' oversized stools, researchers find fragments of trilobite shell, suggesting that this had been the ultimate fate of those unfortunate animals. The pieces are all falling into place. Not only does Anomalocaris have all the features of an apex predator, it leaves behind equally apex waste, while leaving its mark on the living trilobite population too. Evolutionary biologists have even used computer modelling to simulate how the animal would have moved, concluding that it was a fast swimmer, streamlined for speed, with its front appendages perfectly positioned to curve and bring food to its mouth. However, the same computer modelling revealed a worrying limitation to this seemingly matchless Cambrian predator. Its teeth, hardened though they may be, were not rigid enough to be able to bite through a trilobite shell. They are not mineralized like ours or T-Rex's, but merely hardened with organic molecules, making them about as tough as fingernails. And so the structural models reveal that they'd have about the same effect on a trilobite carapace as our fingernails would. Apply enough force and Anomalocaris' teeth would simply buckle, bend, and even break. By this reckoning, Anomalocaris may not have been the fearsome apex predator that we imagine, instead preferring to slurp on soft-bodied prey like worms and sea cucumbers. How then do we reconcile the conflicting evidence of Anomalocaris-sized feces containing trilobite shells and Anomalocaris' incapability of feasting on those trilobites? One answer may lie in the life cycle of the trilobites themselves. Similar to modern arthropods with a hardened carapace, these Cambrian critters solved the problem of growth inside a rigid shell by periodically molting, breaking out of their own skin when they became too cramped, before forging, or more accurately, curing a new exoskeleton shortly after. But there is a brief period of time after a molt when a trilobite is as vulnerable as a newborn. It has discarded one set of armor, but is yet to replace it with a new set. And in modern arthropods, freshly molted individuals are easy to spot in a crowd, thanks to slight color differences from their protected kin. Perhaps then, Anomalocaris learned to spot these color differences with its gigantic eyes, to target the softer, fleshier, and digestible incarnations of the most abundant prey. They had a taste, as it were, for soft-shelled crab over the hard-bodied variety. The bite marks that we find in many trilobite shells and the trilobite fragments we find in coprolites may therefore be a result of Anomalocaris taking its chances on prey that has been sitting out too long in the sun, and has begun to cure that protective armor once again. Considering the inefficient transfer of energy from one trophic level to another, it would take an awful lot of eating to build a body as large as Anomalocaris, so it's reasonable to assume that their appetites were occasionally stronger than their teeth. But that is not the end, because there is another possibility, which came to light when researchers were studying trilobite fossils from South Australia. In addition to bite marks, they found that some of the arthropods seem to have been snapped in two. Considering the amount of force it would take to inflict this kind of unnatural damage, they concluded that Anomalocaris must have been the culprit. By contracting its frontal appendages, this oversized predator would have had the strength to bend and then break a trilobite carapace, presumably damaging and exposing the soft body in the process. Indeed, in this way, the predator's teeth wouldn't have needed to be strong, since by the time the luckless creature reached the mouth, it was already dead and disgorged. And so if a little shell made it into the mouth along with the juicy innards, it would just pass, straight through. Whether or not Anomalocaris was as fearsome as we imagine, we may never know. Perhaps it cruised the Cambrian seafloor, supping on defenseless worms until hunger got the better of it and it ended up challenging prey too tough. Perhaps it tactically targeted the weaker, vulnerable members of the trilobite flock, sometimes making a misstep and breaking a tooth on a tough piece of meat. Or perhaps it used its bizarre anatomy to its advantage, using brute strength to overpower every other creature on the seafloor. Understanding the modes and motives of modern predators is hard enough, but doing it with just a scattering of 500 million year old fossils is another level entirely. What is clear is that regardless of what it ate and how it hunted, Anomalocaris was the unrivaled king of the Cambrian seas. No other animal could challenge this apex predator, giving it unprecedented and unfettered access to the feast of the Cambrian explosion. And yet, as the Red Queen says, it takes all the running you can do just to stay in the same place. Despite its colossal size and power, Anomalocaris didn't stay at the top forever. The evolving animal phyla developing ever new anatomical and behavioral defenses. As the millions of years roll by, other predators rise with their own hunting strategies, and old Anomalocaris soon finds itself shoulder to shoulder with rivals keen to capitalize on the Cambrian bounty. By 488 million years ago, along with many of the other bizarre forms from that time, their entire family line was wiped out in the End Cambrian mass extinction. But their legacy lives on. The strategies they developed, the arms race they helped to escalate, is still being played out in the natural and man-made world today. The lifestyle that they pioneered and the skills they needed to sustain it have helped to shape animal evolution and ecology for all its history. You've been watching the entire history of the Earth. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment letting us know which era of Earth's history you're looking forward to most. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.